The land called Palestine holds a paradox that has haunted the modern world for nearly 8 decades. It is simultaneously one of the most fought-over territories on Earth and one of the smallest, a land no larger than a US state the size of Vermont, yet bearing the weight of empires, religions, and the hopes and traumas of millions. This is not a story of simple victors and vanquished. It is not a story of heroes and villains. It is the story of two peoples, each with deep historical claims, each with histories of suffering, each seeking safety in a land that has never offered safety easily. To understand Palestine, truly understand it, we must journey not just through centuries of history, but through the lives of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Humans have walked this land for 300,000 years. They came as hunters, as farmers, as traders. Long before empires had names, before religions had texts, before nations had borders, people built cities here. They harvested grain from fertile soil. They raised children. They died. The land was simply home. By 3000 BCE, Jericho emerged, one of the world's first cities, a place of bustling commerce, of merchants and traders from 3 continents converging at crossroads. The people who lived there were not abstractions in a history book. They were individuals, farmers tending olive groves that their ancestors had planted, children playing in narrow streets, priests conducting rituals, families breaking bread together in rooms that echoed with laughter and argument. For millennia, Canaanites inhabited the coastal plains. They built ports. They sailed ships. They created alphabets that would eventually transform into modern languages. When the Philistines arrived by sea in the 12th century BCE, a maritime people fleeing their own homeland somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, they settled on the southern coast and developed their own cities, their own culture, their own identity within the land. When Hebrew-speaking tribes migrated into the interior regions, they too became part of this patchwork. They were not invaders, not in the sense we imagine invasion. They were one more population settling into an already inhabited landscape, adapting to its rhythms, its seasons, its ancient patterns of survival. By the 10th century BCE, they had coalesced into a kingdom under David, then Solomon, building a temple in Jerusalem that would transcend history itself, becoming a symbol that would echo through 3,000 years of human consciousness. But empires do not tolerate small kingdoms for long. One by one, the great powers came: Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks. In 70 CE, Rome, that most relentless of empires, would destroy the Jewish temple and scatter its people across the Mediterranean world. The name Palestine itself comes from the Romans, derived from the Philistines, a people who had disappeared millennia earlier. History, it seems, is written by those who come last. After the Romans came the Byzantines, and then, in 637 CE, Arab armies arrived from the peninsula to the south and east. And here is where we must pause to understand something crucial. The people of Palestine did not disappear. They did not vanish when empires changed. They adapted. They converted to Islam, many of them, adopting the Arabic language, becoming part of the Islamic civilization that would flourish across the Mediterranean and beyond. For 1,000 years, Islam shaped this land. The Dome of the Rock rose above Jerusalem in 691 CE, a monument so beautiful, so spiritually resonant, that it stands today as one of the world's greatest achievements in architecture and human aspiration. Muslims made pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Christians walked the streets where Christ had walked. Jews, though fewer in number after the diaspora, maintained communities, maintaining their synagogues, their prayers, their connection to the land of their ancestors. This was not always a story of harmony, but neither was it a story of total conflict. Peoples lived alongside one another, they traded, they sometimes fought, they intermarried. The Crusades brought violence, Christian armies massacring Muslim and Jewish populations in the name of religious conquest. But between the periods of warfare were periods of coexistence, commerce, cultural exchange. In 1516, the Ottoman Empire conquered Palestine and held it for 401 years, longer than the United States has existed as a nation. The Ottoman period is often described by historians as one of relative stability. But what does stability mean to the people living it? Ottoman Palestine was rural, primarily agricultural. Peasants farmed the land as their grandparents had, planting wheat and barley, tending olive groves that their ancestors had planted centuries, perhaps millennia, before. They paid taxes to distant Istanbul. They lived according to Islamic law. They were subjects of an empire so vast that their village might seem insignificant to the calculations of power in Constantinople. Yet they were there. Palestinians were there, a people who spoke Arabic, who followed Islam, who had their own villages, their own families, their own stories and songs and daily rhythms. They were not settlers, they were not occupiers, they were simply people living in a land their families had inhabited for generations, for centuries, for so long that the concept of belonging to Palestine was so fundamental that it needed no explanation. By the 19th century, this ancient stability began to fracture. European powers carved up the Ottoman Empire like a rotting corpse. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the West into something the Ottoman world could not match. Modernity, with its railways, its technologies, its ideologies, began seeping into Palestine. In the late 19th century, two powerful ideologies collided in Palestine, each with its own moral weight and historical legitimacy. The first was Zionism, born from Jewish desperation and genius. For nearly 2,000 years, Jews had lived as minorities in other people's lands. They had thrived in medieval Spain, Ottoman cities, and Polish communities, contributing enormously to human civilization. Yet, they remained perpetually vulnerable. In Christian Europe, they were scapegoats, blamed for plagues, accused of crimes they did not commit, forced into despised professions, forced to wear identifying badges, segregated in ghettos. In 1894, when Captain Alfred Dreyfus, fully assimilated into French society, was falsely convicted of espionage, journalist Theodore Herzl understood a bitter truth. Assimilation would never be safe. Anti-Semitism was not a disease to be cured by progress, it was structural and permanent. The only solution was political sovereignty, a nation-state where Jews could defend themselves and never again be hunted or slaughtered. Herzl's logic was sound. It was born from trauma, but was not irrational. After the Holocaust, when 6 million Jews were systematically murdered, it seemed to many that Herzl had been prophetic. Jews needed a nation-state. Without one, they were eternally vulnerable to annihilation. The second ideology was Arab nationalism, equally compelling and rooted in legitimate grievance. For centuries, Arab lands had been ruled by foreign powers. The Arab world watched as European powers colonized Africa and divided the Middle East. Arab nationalism promised liberation, freedom from foreign rule, and the right to self-determination. In Palestine specifically, this became Palestinian nationalism. Arabs who had lived there for centuries, Muslim and Christian, began seeing themselves as a distinct people with their own history and claim to the land. Palestinian identity crystallized, becoming conscious and politicized. Two ideologies arrived at the same historical moment and collided with inevitability. Both claimed the same territory. Both had legitimate grievances and aspirations. There was not enough room for both to realize their dreams without one people's dispossession becoming the price of another's liberation. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Yet Britain had made contradictory promises to Jews and to Arabs. Both could not be true simultaneously. When Britain took control after World War I, the contradiction became explosive. Jewish immigration surged. Between 1922 and 1945, the population grew from 50,000 to 600,000. Palestinian Arabs watched with alarm as outsiders purchased their land and reshaped the landscape. But these immigrants were not conquerors. They were refugees fleeing persecution, seeking to build new lives on ancestral soil, according to biblical memory. Yet, from the Palestinian perspective, this return was experienced as displacement. Villages became surrounded by settlements. Water access was restricted. Land purchase was constrained. A new reality was constructed around them that they had not chosen and could not control. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. The proposed Jewish state would comprise 56% of Palestine, though it was highly fragmented into three disconnected zones. The proposed Arab state would be similarly divided and economically disadvantaged. Jerusalem would be internationalized. Jewish leadership accepted the partition plan. It was imperfect, but it offered political sovereignty, the dream that Herzl had articulated 50 years earlier. Palestinian Arabs rejected it. From their perspective, they were the majority population being asked to cede more than half their homeland to a minority. It seemed profoundly unjust. Civil war erupted. Between December 1947 and May 1948, before Israel was even officially declared a state, Jewish militias and Palestinian fighters clashed in brutal warfare. Villages burned, massacres occurred, terror was deployed by both sides. Then, on May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared Israeli independence. For the Jewish people, this was resurrection. After 2,000 years of exile, a nation had been reborn. It was the fulfillment of centuries of longing. Survivors of the Holocaust who had lost everything, families, communities, entire worlds, could now imagine a future where Jews would never again be powerless. But this moment of Jewish liberation coincided precisely with Palestinian catastrophe. As Israeli forces consolidated control and neighboring Arab states invaded to support Palestinians, approximately 700,000 Palestinians fled or were forcibly expelled from their homes. Some fled in panic at the sound of gunfire. Some were driven out by military force. Some left believing they would return when Arab armies defeated Israel. They never returned. Entire villages were depopulated. Families who had lived on the same land for generations, sometimes for centuries, found themselves refugees in neighboring countries. Their homes were occupied by Jewish settlers. Their orange groves were taken. Their mosques, became storage facilities or were demolished. Maps were redrawn. Place names were changed. Palestinian history was literally being erased from the landscape. Palestinians call this the Nakba, the catastrophe. It is the foundational trauma of Palestinian identity. What 1948 meant to Jews, liberation, resurrection, return, 1948 meant to Palestinians, exile, loss, dispossession. The same historical event meant opposite things to two peoples. Over 5.9 million Palestinian refugees exist today, descendants of those who fled in 1948 and those who fled in 1967. More than 1.5 million live in refugee camps, officially recognized by the United Nations, many of them in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the Palestinian territories themselves. Refugee camps that were meant to be temporary have persisted for 75 years. Children have been born in them. Grandchildren have been born in them. They exist as suspended communities, not fully integrated into the countries hosting them, unable to return to Palestine, existing in a legal and social limbo that has become intergenerational. Imagine being born in a refugee camp. Imagine your entire life being defined by exile. Imagine knowing stories about a house you've never lived in a village you've never visited, told by a grandmother who escaped with nothing but the memories in her mind. Imagine being told repeatedly that you have a right to return to a place you've never been. This is the emotional and psychological reality for millions of Palestinians. In 1967, Israel fought the Six-Day War against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Israel won decisively. But victory brought territories that complicated everything. Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, territories populated by hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Israeli officials announced that these lands would be held temporarily as leverage for peace negotiations. 57 years later, they are still held. The West Bank, a territory roughly the size of Delaware, is now divided into 3 administrative zones called Areas A, B, and C. The Palestinian Authority administers Area A, 18% of the West Bank. Israel and the Palestinian Authority share administration of Area B, 22%. Israel maintains complete control over Area C, 60%, which contains all Israeli settlements, most of the West Bank's agricultural land, and vast reserves of water. But here is the critical detail. Areas A and B are not contiguous. They are fragmented into 166 separate enclaves, separated from each other by Israeli-controlled territory. Palestinians living in one enclave cannot travel freely to another Palestinian enclave. They cannot go to work, to school, to medical care without passing through Israeli checkpoints where they may be delayed, interrogated, or denied passage. Imagine your country being fragmented into isolated islands. Imagine not being able to travel from your home to your workplace without permission from a foreign military authority. Imagine that permission being arbitrarily denied. This is the daily reality for Palestinians in the West Bank. Jewish settlements in the West Bank have expanded continuously since 1967, despite international law declaring them illegal. Between 600,000 and 750,000 Israeli settlers now live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, building homes on Palestinian land, establishing communities with modern infrastructure, connecting to water and electricity systems, while Palestinian villages nearby struggle with severe water scarcity. To Palestinians, these settlements are concrete manifestations of occupation. They represent a slow-motion land grab. As settlements expand, Palestinian land shrinks. Palestinian communities become more isolated. The possibility of a contiguous, viable Palestinian state becomes progressively more impossible. To Israeli settlers, these communities represent a return to ancestral land. Many settlers are driven by religious conviction, a belief that God promised this land to the Jewish people, and that settling it is a sacred duty. Others are attracted by economic incentives, cheaper housing, tax breaks. Some are seeking refuge from violence in Israel proper. They are building communities, raising families, creating lives. From their perspective, they are not occupiers. They are pioneers, reclaiming land that history had taken from their people. The barrier between these perspectives seems absolute. In 1994, after the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian Authority was established. Limited self-governance was granted to parts of the West Bank and Gaza. The Palestinian Authority has its own police, its own administration, its own symbols of statehood. But it has no meaningful control over borders, no army, no ability to conduct foreign policy. It governs people, not territory. It is an authority that cannot truly authorize anything. The Gaza Strip, a territory barely larger than Los Angeles, has been under blockade since 2007, when Hamas took power. Borders are sealed. People cannot enter or leave without permits. Goods are restricted. The territory has been described by humanitarian organizations as an open-air prison. 2 million people live there in one of the world's highest population densities. When Israel launched military operations in Gaza, in response to rocket fire from Hamas and other armed groups, the humanitarian costs have been catastrophic. Entire neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble. Water systems have been destroyed. Hospitals have been damaged or destroyed. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed. Hundreds of thousands have been displaced. To Israelis, these military operations are acts of self-defense against terrorism. Hamas, they argue, deliberately hides weapons and fighters among civilian populations, using civilians as human shields. When civilians are killed, the responsibility lies with Hamas, not with Israel. To Palestinians, the blockade itself is an act of collective punishment. They see a population being systematically starved of resources, being subjected to military violence with little ability to defend themselves, being treated as an undifferentiated enemy mass, rather than as individual human beings with rights and dignity. The cycle perpetuates. Violence breeds violence. Trauma breeds trauma. Each side viewing the other's security measures as terrorism, each side viewing its own military response as legitimate self-defense.
In December 1987,
a traffic accident in the Gaza Strip changed everything. An Israeli truck collided with Palestinian vehicles, killing 4 workers. It was a moment, a terrible moment, but not unique in a context of occupation and regular violence. Yet, it ignited something. Palestinians, exhausted by 20 years of military occupation, by watching their land taken, by living without rights or dignity, rose in spontaneous rebellion. The first Intifada began with young Palestinians throwing stones at Israeli soldiers. The images circulated globally. Young boys, some barely teenagers, confronting heavily armed military forces. The symbolism was powerful. The powerless confronting power, refusing to accept the occupation through non-violent resistance. But the Intifada was not purely non-violent. As it progressed over 4 years, it included armed attacks. Palestinian gunmen killed Israeli civilians and soldiers. Israel responded with military force. Thousands were killed, the vast majority Palestinians, the majority of those civilians. The Second Intifada, which began in 2000, followed a failed peace process and escalated into sustained violence. This time, resistance groups employed suicide bombings. Young Palestinians, some motivated by religious conviction, some by political ideology, some by simple revenge for killed relatives, strapped explosives to their bodies and detonated themselves in crowded buses, shopping centers, and restaurants, killing Israeli civilians indiscriminately. These suicide bombings are difficult to discuss neutrally because their moral status seems clear. Deliberately killing civilians is terrorism. Yet, the motivations behind them are comprehensible. They emerge from desperation, from a population that sees no political path to liberation, that has endured decades of military occupation, that has watched their land confiscated, their homes demolished, their relatives killed with apparent impunity. To understand is not to justify, but to understand why young people are driven to such extremes is to recognize that the political situation in Palestine has become so desperate, so hopeless, that a significant portion of the population has concluded that suicide bombing is a legitimate, perhaps the only available, form of resistance. Israel responded to the Second Intifada with intense military force. The Israeli military conducted targeted killings of Palestinian resistance leaders, often killing civilians in the process. Israel built a massive separation barrier that physically divided Palestinian communities from Israeli settlements and from Israel proper. The barrier has been called a security fence by Israeli officials and an apartheid wall by Palestinian activists and international human rights organizations. The barrier is 440 miles long. In some places, it is a concrete wall 25 feet high. In other places, it is a chain-link fence with surveillance equipment. It separates Palestinian villages from agricultural land that Palestinians have farmed for generations. It divides Palestinian communities, forcing some Palestinians to travel dozens of miles to reach areas of the West Bank that are geographically minutes away. From the Israeli perspective, the barrier has been effective. It has reduced suicide bombings and rocket fire from Palestinian militants. It is an expression of the right to self-defense and security. From the Palestinian perspective, it is a monument to their confinement, a concrete representation of their imprisonment, the physical embodiment of apartheid. Palestinian identity is rooted in the land, in olive trees that have been cultivated for millennia, in villages whose names have been spoken for centuries, in stories passed down through generations. The Palestinian dialect of Arabic, the Palestinian style of cooking, Palestinian embroidery patterns, Palestinian music, these are expressions of a distinct cultural identity that has survived despite, or perhaps because of, centuries of external rule. The olive tree is particularly symbolic. Palestinian olive trees, in some cases, are thousands of years old. They are harvested each year in a ritual that Palestinian families have performed for generations. Olive oil is central to Palestinian cuisine and Palestinian commerce. When Israeli settlers uproot Palestinian olive groves to build settlements, they are not simply taking land. They are destroying tangible connections to history, to identity, to belonging. Palestinian political identity has been expressed through various organizations. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, founded in 1964, initially called for the complete liberation of Palestine and the destruction of the State of Israel. Over decades, the PLO gradually shifted toward accepting a two-state solution, the coexistence of an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel. Hamas, founded in 1987 during the First Intifada, is simultaneously a social welfare organization and a militant resistance movement. Hamas runs hospitals, schools, and social services for Palestinians. It is also designated as a terrorist organization by the United States, Israel, and the European Union because of its armed activities and suicide bombings. In 2006, Palestinians voted in their first democratic election. Hamas won 44% of the vote. This was shocking to the international community, which had assumed the more secular PLO/Fatah movement would dominate. But Palestinians voted for Hamas because they were frustrated with decades of corruption in the Palestinian Authority, because they saw Fatah as compromised by peace negotiations that had failed to produce Palestinian independence, because Hamas was seen as uncorrupted and committed to resistance against Israeli occupation. But Hamas's election victory led to international isolation. Western governments imposed sanctions. Israel increased military pressure. Within a year, political differences between Hamas and Fatah erupted into open conflict, culminating in Hamas taking control of Gaza in 2007 and Fatah remaining dominant in the West Bank. The division between Hamas and Fatah has fractured Palestinian politics and Palestinian society. Families have been split between Gaza and West Bank territories. The dream of unified Palestinian statehood has been repeatedly delayed. Meanwhile, Israeli settlements continue to expand, making the possibility of a viable two-state solution progressively more difficult. At the heart of this conflict is a profound moral question that has no easy answer. Can victimhood justify the perpetration of further suffering? The Jewish people endured unimaginable persecution. The Holocaust represents an absolute nadir of human civilization, a mechanized, systematic, almost bureaucratic genocide that murdered 6 million Jews. No people in modern history have been persecuted more systematically, more lethally, or with less justification than the Jewish people. Yet the State of Israel, founded as a refuge for persecuted Jews, now possesses one of the world's most powerful militaries. It has nuclear weapons. It maintains military occupation over Palestinian populations. International human rights organizations have documented what they characterize as violations of Palestinian rights, including extrajudicial killings, collective punishment, and military practices that constitute potential war crimes. This is not to equate Israeli and Palestinian suffering. Palestinian suffering has been immense, but it is different in character and scale from the Holocaust. Rather, it is to acknowledge that the founding trauma of the State of Israel, the determination that Jews must never again be powerless, never again be vulnerable to slaughter, has shaped a national security apparatus that sometimes treats Palestinian civilians as threats to be managed, rather than as human beings with rights and dignity. Similarly, Palestinian resistance to occupation is comprehensible and justified by principles of self-determination. Yet the methods employed, suicide bombing of civilians, rocket fire aimed indiscriminately at civilian populations, are acts that kill innocent people. There is no moral relativism that can dismiss these killings as merely consequences of occupation. They are real crimes against real people. Both Israelis and Palestinians have legitimate historical claims. Both have experienced genuine trauma. Both deserve safety, freedom, dignity, and self-determination. Yet the nature of the conflict has been such that one people's security seems to demand another people's insecurity. One people's freedom seems to require another people's confinement. The story of Palestine is ultimately a human story, not a story of abstract political forces or historical inevitabilities, but of individual people trying to live lives, to raise families, to maintain dignity and connection to their land and their culture in circumstances that make those things extraordinarily difficult. It is a story of refugees living in camps for 75 years, raising children in temporary structures that have become permanent. It is a story of settlers building homes on disputed land, convinced of their historical and religious right to be there. It is a story of soldiers, both Israeli and Palestinian, caught between orders from above and the humanity of people in front of them. It is a story of politicians making compromises and calculations that affect millions of lives they will never meet. The future of Palestine remains contested and uncertain. The geography of the land itself is contested. Which territory belongs to whom? Who has the right to live where? Who controls water and resources? But beneath these geographic questions are human questions. How do peoples who have traumatized each other learn to live together? How do victimized populations avoid becoming victimizers? How do nations built on security anxieties learn to see enemies as humans? These questions have no easy answers. Perhaps they have no answers at all. But if there is hope, and hope may be all that remains, it lies in the possibility that both Israeli and Palestinian peoples might recognize each other's humanity, might acknowledge each other's legitimate suffering, and might work together toward a future that honors both people's aspirations, rather than demanding that one must be sacrificed for the other. The story is not finished. The outcome is not determined. The future remains unwritten. And in that uncertainty lies both the tragedy and the possibility of this contested land.